Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling cases in Chicago, Illinois' documented history. Please let me know where you're watching from and when you first heard this story in the comments section before we start. We want to know where these recorded accounts come from and what time of day or night they arrive. America was experiencing wealth and advancement in 1923, with its skyscraper constantly rising and its streets teeming with Model T Fords and well-dressed businessmen. Chicago stood as a testament to industrial success. The city emerged with a fresh feeling of purpose and ambition after surviving both the Spanish flu and the Great War. According to the Chicago Tribune, the city on Lake Michigan is experiencing a new golden era. The future seemed endless, and the night air was packed with speakeasies despite prohibition. However, in a modest neighborhood on the north side, something unimaginable was happening beneath the windy city's shining exterior, in the shadow of its imposing accomplishments. Police archives, newspaper articles, and first-hand accounts collected by the Cook County Historical Society serve as the foundation for what we are going to look at. Until 1967, when a doctoral student named Thomas Wayland discovered them while doing research for his dissertation on the history of medical ethics in Illinois, the majority of these records were kept under seal. His scholarly work would never include what he found. Rather, it was the focus of a brief, privately printed monograph that was briefly read before fading virtually completely from the public consciousness. In the early 1920 seconds, Chicago's North Side was a patchwork of shifting communities. Victorian mansions stood side by side with more contemporary homes, demonstrating the coexistence of old money and new. With its wrought iron fences and tree-lined pathways, Dearborn Street stood for the old guard. It was a site where professionals and established families maintained a respectable presence amongst the city's fast change. The apartment and private practice of Dr. Marcus Blackwood were established at number 1,847 inches, the fall of 1,919. Dr. Marcus Blackwood was a well-known doctor who ran a private clinic from his Victorian home on Dearborn Street, according to official records. He had a stellar resume, having attended Johns Hopkins, worked as an assistant surgeon at Chicago Memorial Hospital, and contributed to a number of the era's medical periodicals. His area of expertise was neurology, which was still in its relative infancy in the early 20th century and still had many unanswered fundamental problems regarding the nature of consciousness and how the human brain functions. Set back from the street behind a tiny but well-kept garden, the Blackwood property was a 3-story Victorian home with characteristic gables and turrets. Dr. Blackwood's professional offices were on the first level, which also included a small pharmacy where he gave his patients their prescriptions, an examination room furnished with the newest diagnostic equipment, and a waiting area adorned with elegant artwork and medical degrees. His private apartments were on the upper floors, which were hardly visited by anyone outside his household. He was considered by colleagues as intelligent, yet a little distant, obsessed with his work. Marcus has one of the best minds I have ever seen, but there is something lacking in his manner. A warmth, maybe, or just that human connection that most of us take for granted. He looks at people like specimens under glass, with clinical interest but little empathy, wrote Dr. Harold Winters, who had studied with Blackwood at Johns Hopkins, in a letter to his wife. Few, if any, were ever invited into his home outside of the professional areas, which he had extensively modified to include a private research laboratory, an uncommon but not unheard of arrangement for doctors of that era who kept independent practices. Neighbors characterized his wife of 10 years, Mrs. Regina Blackwood, as a quiet, withdrawn woman who seemed to live in her husband's shadow and rarely socialized. The pair didn't have any kids. Located on a corner lot that provided a level of privacy uncommon in metropolitan Chicago, the stately 3-story Victorian home on Dearborn Street featured a complete basement. Shortly after his return from military service in 1919, Dr. Blackwood bought the property. After the patriarch's textile company failed during the post-Great War economic readjustment, the Whitmore family, the previous owners, moved to California. Blackwood spent much more than market value for the home, according to local records, which caused some neighbors to take issue, but was eventually explained by his seeming financial success and desire for a famous location. What happened in the basement of his elegant brick house, behind a sealed door and soundproof walls, was unknown to everyone and unimaginable. When neighbors started complaining about an odd smell coming from the area around the Blackwood residence in March 1923, it was the first sign that something was wrong. Initially written off as a sewer issue or even a dead animal stuck nearby, the stench would recur periodically for months, getting heavier every time the earth got wet from rainy days. In her personal journal, Mrs. Harriet Wilkins, who owned a small flower shop 2 blocks from the Blackwood mansion, wrote that the scent was reminiscent of the chemical preservatives the funeral parlor employed, but it also had a hint of something terrible that shouldn't be disturbed. Officer Daniel McCreary, the beat officer who patrolled the area, was informed by Mrs. Wilkins about the stink, but at that time, no formal inquiry was started. Later, Officer McCreary would remember that he had really asked Dr. Blackwood about the odor when he happened to run into him on the street. Perhaps some of the chemical preservatives he was studying had seeped into the ground outside his house, the doctor had indicated. Although he pledged to dispose of the chemicals with greater caution, he reassured the officer that they were safe. After being impressed by the doctor's qualifications and demeanor, McCreary decided there was no need to look into the situation further. Residents started to notice further oddities about the Blackwood residence about this same period. The doctor's routine grew more and more nighttime. Through the small ground-level windows, lights would burn in the basement at all hours. Unusually frequent deliveries of big, heavy packages would arrive, and Dr. Blackwood himself, never domestic servants, would accept them. The fact that Mrs. Blackwood stopped appearing in public completely is possibly the most concerning development in hindsight. The doctor responded that she had developed a nervous condition that required total rest and seclusion when neighbors asked how she was doing. He added that, although he would not say where she had gone, he had sent her to stay with family in the country. Such an arrangement appeared entirely logical at the time. For ladies of Mrs. Blackwood's social status, nervous exhaustion was a typical diagnosis, and recuperation getaways in rural areas were commonplace. No one paid any real attention to Dr. Blackwood's increasingly unpredictable behavior until September of that year. Mrs. Eleanor Pendleton, who lived across the street, told her husband that she had seen the doctor bringing a lot of odd equipment into his house at night, always after midnight, when he thought no one would be looking, and barrels of chemicals. She would later tell the police, as well as odd mechanical devices. A young woman named Sarah Collins, the Pendletons' housemaid, attested to these nighttime activities and added another unsettling detail. She had seen Dr. Blackwood and another man carrying what looked to be an unconscious person through the back entrance of the house on at least 2 separate occasions. When asked if she had reported these instances at the time, Miss Collins said she hadn't, since Dr. Blackwood was a well-respected doctor, and she thought the people who were unconscious were patients in need of immediate care who couldn't wait until morning. The first time it was late October, just past midnight, she recalled when she gave the police statement. I was closing the curtains in the upper guest room when I saw headlights in the alley. A black automobile, a Pierce Arrow, I think pulled up to the doctor's back gate. Dr. Blackwood came out to meet it. He and the driver removed what looked like a person wrapped in a blanket from the back seat. They were very careful, very quiet. I thought perhaps it was a patient who had taken ill suddenly. At that point, Sarah Collins, who had moved to Chicago from rural Wisconsin, had been working for the Pendleton family for 3 years. According to all reports, she was a trustworthy and perceptive young lady who avoided gossip and exaggeration. As a result, her evidence was given considerable weight when it was finally presented to the authorities. Being good friends with a number of the local precinct's policemen, Mr. Pendleton casually brought up these views during a social event. If Detective James Sullivan hadn't been looking into a string of disappearances in the Chicago area, mostly involving people who wouldn't be immediately missed, drifters, the unemployed, and those who were separated from their families, the information could have gone nowhere. By 1923, Sullivan had been with the Chicago Police Department for 15 years. His reputation for thoroughness and perseverance had brought him praise from superiors and disdain from colleagues who favored less rigorous approaches. As he wrote in his private notebook, which would subsequently be found among his belongings, the forgotten ones deserve justice as much as anyone, perhaps more so, as they have no one else to speak for them. Although Sullivan noted the doctor's odd nighttime behavior, he had no need to look into it further. That changed when an electrical fire started in Dr. Blackwood's house on the evening of the 17th of October 1923. The fire was quickly contained to the basement by the Chicago Fire Department. They would be haunted for the rest of their lives by what they found there. The Blackwoods' basement had been converted into what the first responders could only characterize as a scientific madhouse. A laboratory with equipment that even medical professionals could not easily recognize, a makeshift operating room with drainage channels carved into the floor, a storage area with dozens of glass jars containing preserved specimens, and most unsettling of all, a small room at the far end with no windows and a reinforced door, were all separated by the space. The first person to enter this last room was Fire Captain Robert Matt. Room approximately 8 feet by 10 feet. Walls lined with cork insulation. Single cot with restraint apparatus. Evidence of prolonged occupation. Scratch marks visible on interior of door. Writing on walls appears to be made with various substances. His written statement, which was discovered in the police archives, is clinical in its description, but contains a profound disturbance between the lines. It was discovered that an electrical device in the main laboratory room had overheated, causing the fire. Neighbors claim that Dr. Blackwood had departed earlier that evening and was not home when the fire started. He would never go back to the house again. One of the most covert investigations in Chicago's history ensued. The entire site was blocked off by police. Inside those police barricades, detectives were finding evidence of acts so unsettling that most of it was purposefully left out of official reports, while journalists who tried to cover the incident were given a straightforward account of an electrical fault in a private property. Detective Sullivan assumed responsibility for the investigation and collaborated closely with Dr. Sullivan, Frederick Hollis, a Chicago Memorial Hospital neurologist who had been called in to interpret the study materials and lab equipment. In a secret report to the chief of police, they presented their preliminary findings, which depicted systematic human testing. The laboratory contains equipment for measuring electrical activity in the brain, said Dr. Hollis, far more sophisticated than anything currently in use at major medical institutions. There are also devices that appear designed to stimulate specific regions of the brain using precisely controlled electrical currents. The operating area is equipped for both conventional surgery and what I can only describe as experimental neurosurgical procedures. The storage section had the most unsettling features. What were first believed to be standard anatomical specimens, preserved organs, used for medical research, were kept in glass containers of various sizes. Upon closer inspection, it became evident that the brain tissue in several of the containers had been extensively altered, had undergone surgical changes, and had fine metal filaments inserted, all of which Dr. Hollis was unable to explain. In his assessment, he stated, "These are not teaching specimens. These appear to be the results of systematic experimentation on human neural tissue, conducted with a level of precision that I must reluctantly acknowledge exceeds current medical capabilities. I cannot begin to guess at the purpose of these modifications." Among the items found in the basement were 17 journals that were painstakingly written by Dr. Blackwood. These papers describe tests that were carried out over almost 4 years, starting soon after the doctor returned from World War I. According to the earliest notes, a guy is engaged in legal but unconventional medical research. Detective Sullivan's personal notes, found among his belongings after his death in 1952, provide the most comprehensive record of these journals. The later entries reveal something else entirely: a fractured mind, a scientist who had abandoned all ethical constraints in pursuit of what he called the ultimate medical breakthrough. Some of the sections had been copied by Sullivan, who was reportedly unwilling to include them in his official reports because they were too upsetting, or maybe because of pressure from higher up to prevent the information from being made public. One passage, dated April 1921, reads, "Subject 7 continues to demonstrate remarkable resilience. The procedure was administered at 2:15 a.m., and vital signs remained stable throughout. Upon regaining consciousness, subject exhibited extreme distress, but no apparent memory of the procedure itself. This confirms my theory regarding the selective nature of traumatic memory suppression. Will increase duration in next trial. Another entry, from January 1923, shows how far the doctor's work had progressed, or perhaps, how far his mind had deteriorated. The separation was successful for 7 minutes and 22 seconds. The physical form remained functional, while the essential nature was elsewhere. Subject's eyes remained open throughout, tracking movement but showing no recognition or awareness. Upon reintegration, subject spoke continuously for 32 minutes, describing experiences that cannot be reconciled with physical reality. Recording made on Edison cylinder for further analysis. A third entry, dated just 2 weeks before the fire, contained perhaps the most disturbing passage of all. Complete transfer achieved with subject 19. Neural activity ceased in the original substrate and was successfully recorded in its entirety. Playback into the receiver substrate resulted in apparent full consciousness, including all memories and personality characteristics. The implications are staggering. Death, as we have understood it, may be nothing more than a technological problem to be solved. The investigation's most concerning finding was the near-total lack of details regarding the experiment subjects. They were only identified by their numbers in the journals. No names or descriptions were provided. Police looked through missing people reports dating back years, but they were unable to find any conclusive evidence. It seemed as though Dr. Blackwood had chosen his victims especially to ensure their anonymity and the possibility that their disappearance would be overlooked in the bustling life of a developing city. Dr. Blackwood kept in touch with a number of people who worked at nearby hospitals and medical facilities, according to a statement made by Edward Harrington, a medical student who worked as his part-time laboratory assistant. When a patient was admitted who had no family ties or whose next of kin could not be found, these contacts would notify him. Harrington claimed that in certain instances, Blackwood would fabricate death certificates for these people, after which they would be taken to his secret laboratory rather than the mortuary. Harrington asserted that he was only involved in the transportation of these victims because he thought they were already dead and would be utilized for anatomical study, a routine, if somewhat atypical, procedure in medical education at the time. According to Harrington, I never witnessed any of the actual procedures. My role was limited to assisting with the transport of subjects and the preparation of the laboratory. Dr. Blackwood insisted on working alone once the actual experimentation began. He claimed it was for my protection, that if anything went wrong, I would not be implicated. I assumed he meant legal issues regarding the acquisition of cadavers, not whatever was really happening down there. When Harrington, then 24 years old and in his second year of medical school, discovered the true nature of Blackwood's work, he showed extreme astonishment and distress. Despite his thorough assistance with the investigation, he insisted that he had never suspected the full extent of what was going on at the laboratory in the basement. He was not charged, and a psychological evaluation confirmed his claims of ignorance. Soon after, he would drop out of medical school and move to Oregon, where he lived in relative isolation until his death in 1974. Other data, however, indicated that at least a few of Blackwood's subjects were still alive when they got to his lab. With its soundproofed walls and cot fitted with restraints, the tiny room at the back of the basement spoke more to captivity than posthumous examination. Police experts examined the scratches on the inside of the door and concluded that they were caused by human fingernails, some of which were quite new when they were found. The finding, made 3 days into the investigation, was possibly the most unsettling. Detectives discovered a hidden cabinet in the storage area behind a fake wall that held dozens of tiny glass vials, each meticulously labeled with a number that corresponded to the topics in Blackwood's journals. What looked like tiny pieces of organic material attached to fine metallic filaments were suspended in a clear fluid inside these vials. Dr. Hollis examined the vials and wrote, "The organic components appear to be human neural tissue, preserved through an unknown method that has maintained cellular integrity to a degree I would have considered impossible. The metallic elements are unlike anything I have encountered in medical practice. They appear to form a kind of network or lattice throughout the tissue. I cannot speculate as to their purpose, but the precision of their placement suggests a specific and deliberate function." Strange events started to haunt those concerned as the probe went on. Detective Sullivan claimed to have heard strange noises in his house at night, including whispering that were barely audible and scratching behind the walls. The officer who compiled the laboratory's inventory experienced an inexplicable hand tremor that would last the rest of his life. The first person to enter that tiny chamber at the rear of the basement was Captain Matt, who would never talk about what he saw there and asked to be transferred to a firehouse in the farthest corner of the city. After spending the most time reviewing Blackwood's research papers, Dr. Hollis started having strange nightmares in which he was performing unexplainable surgeries on patients who had not been identified. He wrote in his personal journal, "I wake with my hands moving in precise patterns, as if conducting delicate surgery. Though I am a neurologist, not a surgeon. Even more unsettling," he wrote, "is the sense that these movements are not random but purposeful, that I am attempting to recreate procedures I have seen described in those terrible journals." Dr. Hollis left the investigation 2 weeks after he started consulting on it, claiming health issues. Soon after, he would take a leave of absence from Chicago Memorial Hospital and eventually depart the hospital completely. He would stay at a Wisconsin private sanitarium until his death in 1931, after being admitted there in 1926. A nurse who cared for him in his last days would later recollect that his final coherent words were, "He found a way to persist. He's still working, still experimenting." However, the medical records from that period of his life were sealed. The investigation was at a stalemate by December 1923. Dr. Marcus Blackwood was no longer there. No one who fit his description had boarded any trains or ships departing Chicago, and his bank accounts were still intact. He seemed to have just vanished from the world. Although it was dormant, the lawsuit was still formally open. The issue of Mrs. Regina Blackwood was one oddity in the case that was never entirely settled. During the house's examination, no evidence of her presence or her alleged stay with relatives in the country was discovered. When her family in Boston was questioned, they said they hadn't seen or spoken to her in more than a year. Mrs. Blackwood was last seen by a neighbor in February 1923, who said she had seemed particularly pale and preoccupied, almost like she was sleepwalking. According to some detectives, she may have been the first victim, or even one of her husband's victims. Others speculated that she may have run away when she learned about the nature of his job. A third possibility that was never formally accepted but was rumored among the detectives was that she might have volunteered to participate in her husband's trials because of the neurological illness that Dr. Blackwood mentioned. Regardless, Regina Blackwood disappeared from history as thoroughly as her husband did. No remains were ever found, no death certificate was ever filed, and no verified sighting of her after February 1923 was ever confirmed. For over 3 years, the Blackwood home was deserted, even though the property was in a fantastic location and was being offered at a substantial discount. No one would buy it. Finally, in 1926, the city ordered the property's demolition after seizing it for unpaid taxes. The property would stay empty until 1945, when a modest apartment complex was built on it. Over the years, residents of that building would report strange occurrences, such as ongoing cold spots, electrical problems, and the sound of scratching inside the walls. However, these allegations were written off as urban legends, the kind that frequently cling to places with a problematic past. One of the more prevalent rumors concerned the electrical system of the building. Lights flickering rhythmically was a common complaint from tenants, particularly during thunderstorms. Unusual wiring alterations and layouts that seemed to have no function or adhere to any established electrical practices were discovered by maintenance personnel. Although these irregularities were ascribed to subpar construction during the building's hurried post-war construction, some locals continued to believe that a darker force was at work. In her personal files, Mrs. Edith Campbell, who occupied apartment 2B from 1947 until 1954, maintained a thorough record of these electrical disruptions. When her grandson discovered the patterns in 1982, she observed that they occasionally appeared to create a sort of code, repeating sequences that she began to believe were efforts at communicating. Some of these sequences were allegedly decrypted by Mrs. Campbell, who had been a secretary in the War Department during World War II and had some experience with Morse code. She noted the words "still here" and "body remains." When the building's foundation was being renovated in 1958, workmen discovered a sealed compartment that had somehow been missed during construction. This area, which was about 3 feet by 6 feet and lined with lead sheeting, held only one object, an 18-inch tall glass cylinder that held a clear fluid that had long since evaporated, leaving only a residue on the glass and what one worker called something organic, desiccated beyond recognition. Men arrived in unmarked vehicles within hours of the object's discovery to remove it. This item is not mentioned in any official records. In a 1964 interview with a reporter for the local newspaper, Michael Donovan, one of the workers on that day, would subsequently assert that the organic stuff inside the cylinder had seemed to move somewhat when exposed to light. Many people brushed this claim aside as Donovan's exaggeration or misunderstanding. However, in his own files, the interviewing reporter wrote that Donovan had appeared to be truly troubled by the recollection and had declined to provide more details about what he had seen. James Lacier, the reporter, tried to find out who might have taken the cylinder in order to investigate Donovan's claim. His investigations brought him to a private research center outside of Chicago that was connected to the university and some government organizations. He was supposed to visit this facility to write an article about scientific achievements, according to his notes, but the story never got published. According to Lacier's newspaper co-workers, he grew more suspicious in the weeks after his encounter with Donovan, saying that he was being followed and that his house phone was being tapped. In early 1965, he unexpectedly left his job and moved to Arizona, where he would not address the Blackwood issue again. If it weren't for Thomas Whalen's 1967 discovery, the case of Dr. Marcus Blackwood may have remained a somber footnote in Chicago history. Whalen discovered a mention of a Dr. Blackwood in the records of a tiny medical school in western Massachusetts while investigating medical practices of the 1922nd. After more inquiry, it was discovered that a doctor who fit Blackwood's description had started working there in late 1924 as Dr. Martin Blake, teaching anatomy and doing research. According to all accounts, this Dr. Blake was a quiet, somewhat reticent man who mostly kept to himself. His in-depth talks about the nervous system's reactions to harsh stimuli were characterized as intelligent but occasionally unsettling. During his time at the college, he wrote 2 papers that addressed what he called the persistence of consciousness under terminal conditions. Dr. Blake abruptly left his post in 1931, citing health issues. After this date, there are no records of his existence. Whalen's search resulted in the discovery of Chicago's sealed police records and, later, Detective Sullivan's private documents, which his widow had given to the Chicago Police Museum. What came out was a picture of a guy whose sharp intellect had been tainted by Great War events. Dr. Marcus Blackwood had been a field physician in some of the bloodiest battles of the war, according to military documents. In an evaluation, his commanding officer remarked that Blackwood approaches human suffering with scientific curiosity rather than emotional response, and that he had an unusual ability to remain detached even in the most harrowing circumstances. According to medical reports, Blackwood was wounded in 1918 during a German artillery bombardment. Colleagues observed a noticeable shift in his personality after the occurrence, despite the fact that the bodily injuries were somewhat mild. According to a letter from a fellow surgeon, Blackwood had become preoccupied with questions of consciousness and mortality to an extent that borders on obsession. He was repeatedly reprimanded for his alleged practice of performing unapproved examinations on dead practice soldiers, with a particular emphasis on those who had experienced head trauma. Blackwood's latter writing seems to have been influenced by his experiences with trauma, mortality, and the limitations of human endurance on the battlefield. For example, he wrote in one of his journals, "What I witnessed in France cannot be reconciled with our understanding of consciousness. Men with half their brains exposed continued to speak. Soldiers with mortal wounds remained lucid well beyond what medical science would predict possible. There is something fundamental we do not understand about the relationship between the physical form and the conscious mind. I intend to find answers." Blackwood first tried to follow his research through traditional avenues after returning to America. The Ethics Committee turned down his proposal to conduct a research on brain activity in terminal patients at Chicago Memorial Hospital, Similar rejections were experienced by subsequent bids to other institutions. Wayland's study indicates that Blackwood made the decision to set up his own private laboratory at this time, free from ethical restraints and institutional scrutiny. Modified electroencephalograph machines that were intended to measure brain activity more precisely than was customary at the time were among the equipment discovered in the basement laboratory following the fire. Some of the gadgets were primitive by today's standards, while others demonstrated a novel approach to neurological intervention that was decades ahead of its time. These devices also seemed to be designed for electrical stimulation of neural tissue. The devices that appeared to be intended to maintain physiological processes in tissue that had been cut off from its original organism were the most unsettling. They were essentially early life support systems, but they prioritized sustaining neural activity over overall survivability. One of the more perplexing objects found was a device that Dr. Hollis had referred to as a receiver of some kind. Though what it is meant to receive, I cannot say. It was a glass chamber that held a nutrient solution and what looked to be synthetic neural tissue, a web of tiny wires and organic materials arranged in a way that resembled the structure of the human brain. This chamber was connected to a variety of electrical devices that, according to Hollis, appeared to be made to record and then play back particular electrical activity patterns. A worrisome observation was made at the end of Wayland's book, which was privately published in an edition of just 50 copies. 3 people who had attended Dr. Blake's lectures at the Massachusetts College had been located by him. Each of the 3 remembered a demonstration the professor had done in which preserved brain tissue was electrically stimulated. These witnesses claimed that the tissue, which was assumed to have come from an animal source, had reacted in ways that appeared almost deliberate and even intelligent. A former student who was by that time a practicing neurologist told Wayland, "I've spent my entire career working with the human nervous system, and I've never seen anything like what Blake showed us that day. It wasn't random firing of neurons. It was responsive, as if it recognized something in the room." Another student, who later became a trauma psychiatrist, recalled another demonstration in which Blake had shown what he called a record of consciousness, independent of its original substrate. This demonstration involved an early type of electroencephalograph attached to what looked like a preservation jar filled with organic material. According to reports, Blake turned on the apparatus and instructed the pupils to look at the readout, which showed patterns he asserted were exactly like those generated by the conscious human mind. Blake offered to have one student think of a number between 1 and 10, and then ask the device to identify it when the student was skeptical. This witness claims that Blake's vocal instructions caused the machine's readout to alter, and that a sequence of electrical impulses matching the student's selected number was recorded. The witness acknowledged that this might have been a complex deception or magic trick, but he was unable to provide a detailed explanation of how it could have been done. The third student, who became a religious scholar after leaving medicine completely after his stay at the academy, gave perhaps the most unsettling testimony. This person recounted a private discussion in which Dr. Blake had elaborated on his beliefs on awareness. He held that our sense of self is really an electrical pattern that, in theory, could be captured and stored on a different medium. The former pupil stated to Wayland, he spoke of death as a technological problem rather than a biological inevitability. But what disturbed me most was his claim that he had already succeeded in preserving human consciousness outside the body, that he had patients who existed as patterns of electrical activity in his laboratory equipment. When I asked him how such individuals would experience existence, he smiled and said, "Why don't you ask them yourself?" I declined his invitation to visit his private laboratory, and shortly thereafter decided that medicine was not my calling. Thomas Wayland agreed to work as a researcher at a Swiss private university in 1968. He left the majority of his personal possessions in his university office when he abruptly left. One of these was a diary with notes for a sequel to his monograph. The last entry, made 2 days before to his departure, simply states, "He found me." Colleagues' attempts to get in touch with Wayland following his departure were futile. There was no record of his employment at the Swiss organization where he had allegedly accepted a post. A Thomas Wayland had entered Switzerland on the specified date, according to inquiries made through diplomatic channels, but there was no documentation of his following activities or present location. His case is still pending in the American Citizens Missing Abroad Division of the U.S. State Department. About 6 months after Wayland's disappearance, an odd postscript to his abduction occurred. A parcel showed up at his old academic advisor's workplace. An old pocket watch that had belonged to Wayland's grandpa was the only item in the package. A note with the following words was attached: "Time is not what we think it is. Neither is consciousness." I understand now what he discovered. Although handwriting analysis verified that Wayland wrote the message, it offered no insight about his whereabouts or circumstances at the time of writing. According to Dr. Elliot Stern, the academic advisor, the watch behaved strangely. Despite not having been wound, the hands moved erratically, occasionally spinning quickly before coming to a sudden stop, and other times briefly moving backward. Upon examining it with a watchmaker, the craftsman was unable to determine a mechanical cause for these motions. The watch was later locked in a safe deposit box by Dr. Stern, and it is likely still there today. In 1972, the structure on the location of Dr. Blackwood's house was removed to provide space for a business. Workers discovered a portion of the original basement that had somehow survived the prior demolition while excavating for the new building's foundation. Reports submitted to the building business stated that there was a wall in this region with hundreds of numerals engraved in what appeared to be a random order. Mathematicians' analysis of these numbers revealed no obvious pattern. There are no documented photos of the wall because it was demolished during building. But out of curiosity, Joseph Mazerke, one of the construction workers, had copied a section of the sequence into his own notebook. Mazerke sustained a severe brain injury in an unrelated work-related incident in 1978. While recuperating, he started to have what his physicians called complex auditory hallucinations. He said he could hear voices in a language he didn't comprehend. Mazerke abruptly started reciting the numerical sequence he had copied years prior during a neuropsychiatrist appointment. In contrast to his customary style of speech, he then said in a clear and quiet voice, according to the session transcript, "These are not random. These are the coordinates of consciousness outside the body." When asked later about this statement, he did not recall saying it. Unrestricted by moral principles, the case of Dr. Marcus Blackwood marks a troubling period in the history of scientific investigation. It's still unclear what he learned from his unethical experiments and what he actually found in that basement lab. Maybe this is a good thing. Certain doors are difficult to close after they have been opened. Once acquired, certain knowledge cannot be undone. An old man, who only identified himself as Joseph, entered the Chicago Police Department in 1963 and demanded to talk to someone about the doctor who worked with the electricity and the human mind. He stated that he had been a patient of Dr. Blackwood's in 1922. Joseph described medical operations that seemed beyond the scope of 1,920 seconds technology, speaking with exceptional accuracy and detachment, according to the desk sergeant who collected his statement. When pressed for more details, the man reportedly smiled and said, "He helped me understand that we are not what we appear to be. We are electrical patterns. Nothing more. And patterns can be altered, can be copied, can persist beyond their original medium." The sergeant made a brief report of this encounter, filing it away with the long-dormant Blackwood case. He mentioned equipment that could see inside the mind and separate the self from the body temporarily. When he went back to the station the next day, his report was not in the files. He found that the address given was a vacant lot that had been unoccupied for decades when he tried to find Joseph to get a more thorough explanation. No additional research was done. The sergeant's actions in the weeks after this interaction were possibly even more worrisome. He grew more reclusive, according to colleagues, and was occasionally observed looking off into space while moving his lips as though speaking to an invisible person. He asked to be moved to an administrative role, away from the public eye, after a month of acting in an increasingly unpredictable manner. He only mentioned the incident in passing at his 1970 retirement interview. Some people leave an impression on you. Some people leave more than that. The same thing happened in 1982 when a woman in her 70s went to a security guard at the Chicago Police Museum and asked to see the Blackwood materials. When she was told there was no such exhibit, she became upset and demanded that she had to alert someone about the doctor's success. She claimed to have been a nurse who had worked briefly for Dr. Blackwood in 1923 and said that he had managed to extract consciousness from the body and store it somewhere else. She exited the premises before the guard could arrest her or obtain additional information. Attempts to identify her later on using the guard's description failed. Despite her apparent age, the woman had talked with exceptional clarity and precision, according to the incident report written by the guard, Michael Ferris. Her eyes were what struck me most, he wrote. Shortly after this meeting, Ferris would want to be transferred to daytime responsibilities, saying that he no longer felt comfortable working alone in the museum at night, since they seemed somehow too alert, too focused, like she was looking at something beyond what was physically present. Dr. Lillian Hargrove, the museum's curator at the time, looked into the incident briefly in an effort to ascertain whether any materials connected to Blackwood might actually be in the museum's holdings. The only thing she found throughout her search was a little wooden box that contained what looked to be an early 1923 electroencephalogram recording. Dr. Hargrove, a medical history specialist, described the electrical activity patterns on the yellowed paper strip as unlike any brainwave patterns I have ever encountered in my studies. The box and its contents were later moved to the Cook County Historical Society for preservation. A contemporary office building now stands where Dr. Blackwood's house once was. Unusual electrical phenomena are sometimes reported by employees, such as lights that flicker in patterns or electronic gadgets that don't just fail but malfunction in certain ways. In 2002, a night shift security guard reported seeing a man dressed in early 20th century attire standing on the basement level, writing in a notebook. The guard resigned that night and refused to return to the facility, and when confronted, the figure allegedly glanced up and said, "The work continues." The subjects remain viable. Additional information not mentioned in the public story can be found in the security company's incident report, which was acquired in 2010 through a Freedom of Information request. According to this report, the guard, whose name was withheld, claimed that the figure had not actually spoken out loud, but that instead, the words had been heard inside his head, along with a feeling he described as like fingers moving through my brain. The guard reported having severe headaches and experiencing lost time in the days after the incident, during which he would reportedly perform intricate mathematical calculations without realizing it. Are these contemporary accounts true in any way? They're probably just urban legends, the kind that grow up around places with a problematic past. The ability of the human mind to recognize patterns, interpret coincidences, and create stories to explain the unexplainable is astounding. The most unsettling part of the Blackwood case may not be what it reveals about one man's plunge into immoral scientific endeavors, but rather what it implies about consciousness itself, our basic nature, and the potential that what we perceive as an integrated self may be more brittle and pliable than we would like to think. Dr. Marcus Blackwood's writings, which were found in his laboratory in the basement, are still sealed in the Cook County Historical Society's archives. Researchers with valid academic qualifications and institutional support are the only ones who are allowed access, which requires special clearance. Seldom do those who have been allowed to view these documents go into much detail about what they contain. In a 1975 private letter to a colleague, one researcher noted, "The most troubling aspect is not what Blackwood did. Human history is unfortunately replete with examples of such cruelty in the name of knowledge, but rather what he seems to have discovered. If even a fraction of his claims can be substantiated, we may need to reconsider our most basic assumptions about the nature of human consciousness." In 1988, Dr. Eliza Kaplan, who was researching the history of neurological research, spent 3 months studying the Blackwood materials. Although many of Blackwood's methods were rudimentary by today's standards, she pointed out in her formal report that they foresaw advancements in neuroscience that would not be widely accepted for decades. The disturbing implication is that Blackwood thought he had successfully downloaded human consciousness into non-biological storage media, almost a century before such concepts became part of our technological discourse. Her evaluation of his theoretical framework was even more concerning. Blackwood appears to have been working from a model of consciousness that treats it as an electrical pattern that can be recorded and transferred, something akin to how we now understand computer data. A footnote in Dr. Kaplan's report was later removed from public versions of the document. This footnote indicated experimental results that could not be explained by any known scientific principles of the 1,920 seconds, or indeed by current understanding. The nature of these results was not detailed, according to a colleague who had access to the original edition. According to Dr. Hollis's study and bits and pieces of the journals, Blackwood had created a theory of consciousness that was very distinct from the dominant ideologies of his day. According to his theory, our thoughts, memories, personalities, and the core of who we are all electrical patterns that can be isolated from their biological foundation. Even more unsettling was his belief that he had discovered a means to record and conserve this pattern, transferring it from one media to another. In the most divisive section of his notebooks, dated September 1923, he wrote, "The pattern that constitutes consciousness is not dependent on the brain, any more than music is dependent on the specific instrument that produces it. The brain is merely the current vehicle, the temporary housing. I have proven that the pattern can be extracted, preserved, and reinstated in another medium. The implications are profound. Death, as currently understood, may be nothing more than a failure of technology, our inability to preserve and transfer the pattern before the original medium deteriorates beyond recovery. I set out to understand the relationship between the mind and the brain, between consciousness and its physical substrate. What I discovered was that there is no relationship because they are not two things, but one thing viewed from different perspectives. What we call the self is merely a pattern, an electrical sequence that can be recorded, altered, and reproduced. I have done all three. The ethical implications are, I admit, staggering. But knowledge once gained cannot be unknown. The door is now open, and others will eventually find their way through it. This letter, written by Dr. Blackwood, under the pen name Dr. Blake, is his last known writing and was found among his personal belongings after his suicide in 1931. A simple note discovered next to the body said, "He showed me proof. God help us all. Dr." William Carmichael, the letter's recipient, had been Blackwood's mentor during his medical education and one of the few co-workers with whom he had a personal contact. A well-respected member of the Chicago medical community, Carmichael was renowned for his conservative methods of practice and research. Those who knew him were surprised by his suicide, and no convincing reason was ever found for it. It wasn't until the records were found during the settlement of Carmichael's estate many years later that the connection to Blackwood's letter was established. As part of the investigation into Carmichael's death, the police were given a small glass vial containing what appeared to be a piece of neural tissue suspended in a clear fluid, along with a set of technical instructions for what Blackwood called reactivation. Although their current location is unknown, these materials were the most concerning aspect of this final communication, not the letter itself. They were never moved to a medical facility for research, and they are not listed in any evidence inventory pertaining to the case. They just disappeared from history. Since then, developments in neuroscience and our comprehension of consciousness have followed more traditional, moral paths. If Dr. Marcus Blackwood did make the findings he claimed to have made, his work is still outside the accepted realm of science. Maybe this is also for the best. It is not appropriate to cross some thresholds. At least until we gain the discernment to utilize it sensibly, some knowledge ought to be out of our grasp. Over the past century, the basement of the former Blackwood home has undergone numerous reconstructions. Subsequent construction operations have modified, filled in, and dug the ground. The original structure is no longer physically present. However, employees of the structure that now stands on the site occasionally have an odd experience when they go to the lowest floors, a sense of being watched, of ideas that don't seem to be their own briefly slipping into awareness. Maintenance personnel find it difficult to explain why they won't enter some parts of the basement by themselves. From 2005 to 2011, Jennifer Lawson, an administrative assistant in the building, wrote a blog entry about her experiences that briefly attracted attention in some online forums that focus on paranormal events. It wasn't like a traditional haunting, no cold spots, no sounds, nothing you could point to and say, "That's strange," she stated. It was more like moments when my thoughts weren't entirely my own. I would be working at my desk, completely focused on a task, and suddenly I would find myself thinking about electrical currents in neural tissue, or the persistence of pattern independent of substrate technical concepts I had no knowledge of and no reason to be considering. It was as if someone else's thoughts were bleeding into mine. Several other people who claimed to have had similar experiences in the building commented on Lawson's post. The experience of getting intricate technical information without any obvious source information that, upon further investigation, frequently turned out to be connected to cutting-edge ideas in electrical engineering or neuroscience, was a recurrent motif in these testimonies. These events were more common during electrical storms or building power fluctuations, according to a number of respondents. Workers unearthed a little metal box embedded in the remnants of the original foundation wall in 2010 while installing a new electrical system. One glass slide, the kind used for examination under a microscope, was within. What seemed to be neural tissue was found on the seemingly well-preserved slide. Medical professionals analyzed the tissue and found that it was human in origin, but it had structural anomalies that were difficult to explain. A specialized laboratory received the sample for additional analysis, but it was declared lost in transit. There is no proof that the sample reached its destination. One of the workers who witnessed the discovery claims that at the very moment the box was opened, there was a brief surge in the building's electrical system. With the exception of one camera in the basement, which instead recorded a burst of static that, when examined frame by frame, seemed to have a pattern resembling an electroencephalogram reading, all of the building's security cameras recorded this surge as a momentary stoppage in recording. In the weeks after the incident, Robert Chen, the worker who had opened the box, reported having vivid dreams in which he found himself in a laboratory that matched descriptions of Blackwood's basement facility. One technician who looked into this anomaly described it as like someone screaming in electricity. He saw treatments being carried out in these nightmares that he could not have learned about in everyday life. Even more unsettling was his assertion that he was someone else, someone who was deeply knowledgeable about neurological processes and had a compulsive interest in maintaining consciousness. In the dreams, instead of himself. After a while, Chen sought mental health treatment for what was identified as trauma-induced stress disorder. According to his therapist, Chen's depiction of the dream laboratory contained information that matched 1,923 police reports documents Chen could not have accessed. It's possible that we will never fully understand the magnitude of Dr. Blackwood's work or what transpired in that basement laboratory in 1923. The physical evidence is mostly scattered or destroyed. The witnesses are long dead, and the documents that remain are incomplete. All that's left are questions, frightening possibilities, and the disconcerting implication that maybe some secrets are better kept hidden. The case of Dr. Marcus Blackwood is a sobering reminder to anybody studying the history of medicine of the significance of ethical boundaries in scientific investigation. It is one of the most unsettling unsolved mysteries in Chicago, according to those who are interested in the city's darker periods. And for others who work at or close to the site where his house used to be, it is a constant source of anxiety, a persistent feeling that something basic was changed there and that it has never been completely fixed. In 1947, a man who matched Dr. Blackwood's description was last seen in Buenos Aires. At a medical meeting, an elderly guy identified himself as Dr. Martin Blake, according to a visiting American doctor. This version claims that the man talked extensively about theoretical methods for expanding human awareness beyond its physical bounds. In response to the American's doubts about such possibilities, the old man allegedly grinned and remarked, "I don't deal in theories, doctor. I deal in demonstrated realities." The man did not show up for a planned presentation the next day. An investigation showed that no Dr. Blake had registered for the conference. 5 years later, when coworkers at his Boston office began to notice increasingly strange conduct, the American doctor, Dr. William Merritt, would himself become the focus of an investigation. After hours, Dr. Merritt started working on unapproved research on electrically stimulating neural tissue. When questioned, he said he was carrying on the work of a brilliant predecessor. He vanished from his house shortly after, leaving behind notebooks containing what one person called the ravings of a mind coming apart and laboratory equipment that his colleagues did not recognize. Dr. Merritt was never found, and the case is still unsolved. An intriguing side note to this story surfaced in 1987, when a retired nurse who had worked with Dr. Merritt said that in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Merritt had told her about a transformative encounter with an elderly colleague who had shown her a technique that could preserve a person's essence beyond the bounds of biological life. The nurse claimed that Merritt had shown her a little glass vial that contained what looked to be brain tissue attached to tiny metallic threads. This description is consistent with the specimens that were discovered in Blackwood's lab decades prior. Merritt came forward and told a startling story. The thing that disturbed her the most was when she remembered Merritt's last words to her. "He's still alive, you know, not in the conventional sense, but alive nonetheless. He found a way to continue his work beyond the limitations of a single lifetime, and now he's offered me the same opportunity." Sometimes, in the hushed corridors of some medical research institutes, in the whispered discussions of those who research the most remote reaches of neuroscience, the name of Dr. Marcus Blackwood comes up not as a trailblazer or a visionary, but as a warning, a reminder of what happens when bright minds break free from morality and ethical restraints. His is a sad chapter in the otherwise bright history of medical advancement, a legacy of shadow, and maybe the work goes on someplace. The trends continue. Once acquired, the information travels far from its source, striking coastlines like ripples in calm water. All we can do is hope that whoever might have inherited Blackwood's discoveries has the discernment and self-control that he so sadly lacked. A warning to anyone who hears this story and feels compelled to find out more. Some things are better left unopened. It's preferable to leave certain questions unanswered. The line separating banned information from scientific research is not always obvious, and individuals who cross it may find it difficult to find their way back. The Dearborn Street basement has long since been covered over, filled up, and removed from Chicago's physical landscape. However, there is still a remnant of Dr. Marcus Blackwood's legacy in the realm of memory, in the murky corners of medical history, and in the lingering uneasiness that occasionally afflicts those who work in particular buildings in that area of the city, a reminder of that awful year, 1923, when a reputable doctor carried out experiments that no ethical code could possibly support, and possibly unearthed facts that no human mind was intended to understand. The equipment, specimens, and journals have all been destroyed, sealed away, or dispersed. However, once information is created, it tends to endure. Once established patterns tend to recur, and the threads that Dr. Blackwood started to unravel continue to do so somewhere in the great fabric of human understanding, leading to places we might be better off never discovering. These ideas included thorough protocols for studies that involved the transfer of neural activity between organic substrates. These studies had nothing to do with her own research, but when she drew them up for her faculty advisor, they were judged to be ethically repugnant but theoretically sound. When the thoughts got more frequent, the students sought mental health treatment, stating that they seemed not like my own ideas, but like someone else's memories. After moving to the West Coast to finish her education, the problems went away. Following a visit to the building for a job interview, a Northwestern University neuroscience graduate student reported having intrusive thoughts of a technical nature in 2017. A recent development in state-of-the-art neurological research is arguably the most worrisome. Funded by affluent individuals who have a personal interest in prolonging human longevity or preserving consciousness beyond biological death, the work is being carried out at private laboratories with no monitoring. Although the public face of this research focuses on medical applications, such as better neural interfaces for prosthetics, treatments for degenerative brain diseases, and a deeper understanding of consciousness itself, some observers have pointed out unsettling similarities to the theoretical framework presented in Blackwood's journals. The transfer of simple learned behaviors was achieved through studies in which the electrical patterns of brain activity in one organism were effectively recorded and then played back into the neural tissue of another, according to a 2015 research published in a top neuroscience journal. Although Blackwood was not specifically mentioned, those who were familiar with his work could not help but notice the clear echo of his theories. The authors stated that their work had been influenced by early 20th century theoretical models that, although imprecise by today's standards, anticipated many current developments in our understanding of consciousness as an emergent property of neural electrical activity. Pay close attention. There is a sound during the quiet hours, when the city is asleep, similar to the sound of a pen scratching on paper, observations being noted, and knowledge being saved. The work continues. The subjects remain viable. And somewhere, in the shadowiest recess of that now gone cellar, a door that ought to have remained permanently closed is still open.